Rebecca MacKinnon is a former Shorenstein Fellow who came to us from CNN. She was a terrifically serious and effective correspondent, bureau chief in China and so forth. And she might even still be at CNN, I think, perhaps, if they hadn't told her to make her reporting dumber. I mean, I think that was the...
my expertise was getting in the way.
Expertise was getting in the way. We'll try to do something about that, Rebecca. When Rebecca was here, she was clearly casting for something that would really engage her mind and imagination, and she found it in co-founding Global Voices, which was a visionary website that basically put together people who were serious about the world in countries all over the world and made them into a community. It's something that has been an enormous success and grown in power, influence, and usefulness over time. She is now, let me see how many titles you have here. Visiting Fellow at Princeton Center for Information Technology, policy, and, well, she's really one of the deep thinkers of our time in this kind of area. But she comes from not only a journalistic background of her own, but my wife and I wrote a book about the Bingham family some years back, and it included Rebecca's grandfather, who was also a terrific journalist himself. So, Rebecca.
Thanks very much. Just to clarify, because I know the people who are giving me my current fellowship would appreciate this. I'm currently a fellow at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C. I'm no longer at Princeton. Just wanted to clarify.
Sorry.
They appreciate being named. But I'm here to have what I think will be a very stimulating conversation with Abderrahim Foukara, who is the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for Al Jazeera. And before I launch into my first questions for Mr. Foukara, I just want to kind of set the scene with my own experience kind of directly with Al Jazeera and interacting with Al Jazeera when I was on the ground as a reporter and seeing how people were reacting to Al Jazeera vis-a-vis my own reporting for CNN. And actually, 10 years ago this week, I was in Peshawar, Pakistan, in northwestern Pakistan, reporting for CNN in the wake of 9/11, and the United States had just recently started bombing in Afghanistan. And a week or so, 10 years ago from today, Walter Isaacson, who was running CNN at the time, wrote a memo to producers, and it leaked almost immediately to the press, in which he said it was perverse to focus too much on the casualties and hardships of people in Afghanistan in the wake of what had happened in New York. And of course, this got into the Pakistani press and into the press around the Islamic world, and people were not very impressed by that, and it of course made it much more difficult to operate as a CNN correspondent in that region. But it also was, I think, part of the dynamic that was happening in the Muslim world at that time, where audiences were turning to Al Jazeera, viewing it as the credible source. And these types of incidents with CNN and others were kind of shifting the credibility of global media in the Muslim world away from things like CNN and towards Al Jazeera. And I just experienced that on the ground in a very personal way. So I thought I would kind of put that in that context. And we will, of course, return, I think, to Afghanistan and Iraq later in our conversation. But I do want to start with the Arab Spring. And one of the interesting things that Mr. Kanfar, who is recently, until very recently, running Al Jazeera, said was that Al Jazeera has played the role of really liberating the Arab mind, is one thing he said at one point, and created the idea that when you have a right, you should fight for it, and that this was a role that Al Jazeera played in kind of pointing out injustices and hardship around the Arab world and kind of politicizing people in many ways. And what's your own experience with the role that Al Jazeera played in the Arab Spring even happening?
I mean, the way I look at it is that this was an investment that started to be made about 15, 16 years ago when Al Jazeera was created. And the investment was in a political and media environment across the region that was obviously dominated by governments. We're talking about censorship and information control. And that's basically what was prevalent at that time. Each government in the region controlled the television and the radio airwaves in that country, and therefore what people in each individual Arab country saw, they saw the activities of the president or the king, for example. They didn't see if there was an opposition. That opposition never had a face. People didn't see it. So the first investment that Al Jazeera made was obviously to give that opposition in various instances a face, so that people within each individual country began to know that there was a different narrative from the narrative that they were hearing from their own government. I would say that in particular what epitomized this investment was one show called Al-Ittijah al-Mu'akis on the Arabic channel, or Crossfire. And the way I usually like to identify Crossfire is, if you can think back to when Crossfire on CNN was really feisty, and marry that together with Jerry Springer, and you begin to get an approximation what Al-Ittijah al-Mu'akis was. And it was a simple and clever gimmick, if you will. You invite two people who represent two different ends of the spectrum on any given issue. It could be political, it could be social, religious, what have you, and you let them debate it, and you let them shout at each other, and sometimes throw things at each other. And people found that, apart from being liberating as a program, it's a taste of something new that they had not experienced before. And if you fast forward to what happened in Tunisia, I mean, we heard before that revolutions are unpredictable. And I think for all the things that, Waddah or other people from Al Jazeera have been saying about the role that Al Jazeera played in those things, we did not see Tunisia coming. Nobody did. Things started in Tunisia, and we covered them as unrest in Tunisia, reminiscent of previous unrest in Tunisia. Nobody thought that it was actually going to culminate into the toppling of the president. But once Tunisia happened, again, based on the strength of historical precedent, we knew that if it happened in Tunisia, the next likeliest candidate would be Egypt. And if you're Arab, you know that if it happens in Egypt, it's going to happen everywhere else in the Arab world. The second, in terms of investment, the second biggest investment that Al Jazeera had made was actually in the infrastructure of Al Jazeera in Egypt. Egypt being the most pivotal Arab country, all eyes have always been on Egypt in the region for all sorts of different reasons. And therefore, that led Al Jazeera to heavily invest in the infrastructure of Al Jazeera, so that when things began to shake in Egypt, despite all efforts by the Mubarak governments to shut down Al Jazeera, to fiddle with its satellite frequencies and prevent it from getting the picture to Egyptians and to Arabs outside of Egypt, Al Jazeera was well equipped to actually circumvent that. So there was some massive and decisive investments that were made. That was the second one of them. The third one that was made was the marriage with social media. A lot of money, even before Tunisia had happened, a lot of money had been invested in how to deal with the issue of social media. A special department had already been in place, so that when the pictures started coming in from Tunisia, and then from Egypt, and later on from Libya and other parts of the Arab world, Al Jazeera was ready to deal with that.
I mean, speaking of social media, it's been my observation that Al Jazeera has been much more comfortable in its relationship with social media than most American news organizations have been, who have been much more kind of uncomfortable with, you know, how to deal with citizen media. Why do you think that is? Why has Al Jazeera just been more quick to embrace the use of social media, a more symbiotic relationship between journalists and people contributing reports from the street than say some of the Western broadcasters and newspapers?
I mean, as a lot of people know, Al Jazeera had by that time had a long history of confrontation and conflict with Arab governments. It had been hassled in almost every Arab country from the Gulf to the Atlantic. And when you have a massive story such as Egypt, which is really the bread and butter of your coverage, but at the same time there are serious constraints and impediments by the government of Egypt on how you cover it, if they let you cover it at all. Obviously, social media becomes a major second option to you. We've always known that social media, you relying on pictures, for example, coming to you from inside a country like Syria, we've always known that is a process fraught with editorial danger, because you get these pictures, you don't know who's actually sending the pictures, you don't know how representative, how truly representative the pictures are of what's actually going on inside a country like Syria. But you don't have a choice. So the decision is, or was at least in the case of Syria initially, the decision was quite an adventure, if you will. But not covering Syria would have been extremely detrimental to the coverage of the region as a whole. So Al Jazeera probably has had much more of an incentive than CNN or MSNBC or Fox or BBC even in terms of resorting to social media. But as I said at the outset, the infrastructure was already there even before Tunisia happened. And that was another big incentive to rely on social media on the part of Al Jazeera more than other networks did. If I may just make one qualitative difference in terms of what social media have done and what Al Jazeera has done. I mean, to me, when things started happening in Tunisia and they culminated in Ben Ali fleeing the country, a lot of people started calling it the Facebook revolution, and Twitter revolution, what have you. And fine, I mean, if you want to call it that I don't have a big issue with it, except that the people who really made that revolution happen, they made it happen over 30 years. I mean, there were strikes, labor strikes, there were people who were detained, there were people who were tortured, there were people who were killed. As you know, Ben Ali had touted Tunisia in the same way that the Chinese have been doing as an economic success. The only difference, obviously, is that the Chinese, the Communist Party in China, did offer the Chinese a high standard of living. Turned out that Ben Ali, who was going around saying that the standard of living in Tunisia approximated the standard of living in Belgium, turned out that to be a complete lie. So, you know, all those things percolated into the revolution. What social media did in the case of especially Tunisia and Egypt was, if you will, to provide the dots for the revolution. People used those media to organize and to give us, people outside of Tunisia and outside of Egypt, an idea of what actually was going on on the streets of Sidi Bouzid or in Maidan Tahrir in the case of Egypt. What Al Jazeera did was to actually help connect those dots. Because if you take the coverage of Tahrir Square, people had a platform in Tahrir Square to actually discuss the mechanics of the revolution. They had a platform to discuss with each other where they were going with those dots, where they were going with the protests, what they hoped to achieve. They, through the use of Al Jazeera, they mobilized in a way to outmaneuver the Mubarak regime. And I think that was the qualitative difference. Did Al Jazeera create the revolution in Egypt? Or I think that's nonsense. It didn't. We at Al Jazeera would like to think that it did. But in my eyes, the prime role that Al Jazeera did was to actually enable people inside Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere to talk to each other and strategize.
Now, there's been a lot of speculation over why Mr. Khanfar recently left Al Jazeera, and there's also been discussion about Al Jazeera's overarching sort of editorial and geopolitical agendas, given its ownership by the royal family of Qatar. And there's been some criticism, both by activists in the region and others, about different emphases and coverage of different countries. So for instance, Bahrain, Al Jazeera has been criticized for going lightly on the government and going lightly on the human rights abuses against people involved with the uprisings there. And it's also been pointed out that Al Jazeera has been extremely pro-Libyan rebels and was sort of cheerleading for the rebels. And a lot of media around the world, I guess, has been doing so. But these have just been cited as examples of how Al Jazeera's coverage, at least to some extent, has mirrored a little bit the geopolitical preferences, let's say, or allegiances of the royal family in Qatar. And what's your response to that?
Well, I mean, what I usually say to that is that, just as a reminder, the Qataris, they pump hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into the network. And by the way, the network has become an empire. It certainly became an empire under Waddah. You have the Arabic channel, you have the English channel, you have the documentary channel, you have the Mubashir channel, which is an Arab C-SPAN of sorts. This is a major media empire. And the Qataris, when they pump all that money into it, clearly they want to get something out of it. This is not a charity. And as you know, no media, no news outlet is a charity. You fund it because you want to get something out of it. What do they get out of it? An awful lot. This is a tiny country that sits right next door to some very powerful players. Saudi Arabia is one of them, for example. And yet, in the space of 15 years, it has become a major regional player, thanks in no small measure to Al Jazeera. So let's just get that established. Waddah, other than what he's actually stated in public, I don't know if he had any other reasons for stepping down. There were all sorts of reports that the WikiLeaks revelations showed that the Americans had lent on him to change coverage and so on. If you want to believe that, you believe it. I would just say that as a matter of principle, if you're any news outlet with the kind of clout that Al Jazeera has in that part of the world, and with the kind of strategic interests that the United States has in that part of the world, it is almost inconceivable that you would not have a constant conversation with Al Jazeera if you're the US government. And that certainly has been the case. I was actually in Doha. This was 2 years ago. And I was absolutely flabbergasted when Hillary Clinton showed up for a meeting with the editorial board of Al Jazeera, Waddah included. And I sat in on that meeting, and concerns were raised by Hillary Clinton and her team. So all I'm saying is that if you are in that position, it is almost inconceivable that you would not come under a certain amount of pressure to go in that direction or to go in that direction. Did Waddah go in the direction that the Americans wanted him to go? He says no. We'll never know, I guess, the truth of that. But I find it totally normal for a government such as the government of the United States to want to have that kind of conversation with Waddah and Al Jazeera. Bahrain. You could look at Al Jazeera as an adjunct of the Qatari government, but you could also look at it as a news outlet that has caused them as a government a lot of headaches. I mean, if you look at the number of governments in the region that have at one point or another had problems with the Qatari government, even going as far as severing diplomatic relations because of Al Jazeera, you begin to get, an idea of how many problems Al Jazeera actually dragged the Qatari government into. If you look at the complicated relationship they've had with the US government, especially under George Bush, and you think, why would they put themselves in a position where they have to suffer so many major headaches unless they got something out of it, unless they expect to get something out of Al Jazeera? In the case of Bahrain, for all the criticism on the blogosphere about why Al Jazeera supported the Libyan rebels and it didn't support the protesters in Bahrain, that may be a legitimate criticism. What people often do not know is that the extent to which the Bahraini government went in trying to prevent Al Jazeera from being there on the ground to cover the events in Bahrain does to a large degree explain why the coverage of Al Jazeera in the eyes of its critics was not adequate in Bahrain. You compare that coverage with the coverage of Libya, yeah, sure. I mean, the coverage of Libya was much more extensive. But you have to remember that the Libyan rebels from day one had Benghazi under their control. And in Benghazi, Al Jazeera was welcomed with open arms. Not so the case with Bahrain. You could argue...
You could have used more social... There was a lot of social media coverage coming out of Bahrain that you could have leveraged much more.
You could argue that the government of Qatar itself came under pressure from the Saudis, for example. I wouldn't be surprised one bit if they did. And you could also argue that the Qatari government did have some reservations about the way Al Jazeera wanted to cover events in Bahrain. It's very likely that those pressures did exist. I don't know exactly if those pressures did exist, how they translated in the relationship between Al Jazeera and the government of Qatar. Did somebody from the government pick up the phone and talk to Al Jazeera and say, do not cover it? That, in my experience, that's not the way they do business. That's why they have the Board of Governors that acts as a buffer between the government and the station. I think that the problem that a lot of people make the assumption that a lot of people make, including people at Al Jazeera, is going around saying Al Jazeera is a 100% independent television channel.
Right, of course it's not.
But it's not. There's no such thing as a 100%
Right.
independent channel. But it is one of the most independent channels that the region has certainly had. Where does the coverage of Bahrain fit into that? I'm not sure I can tell you with certainty the mechanics of why, other than that our teams were not given access to Bahrain, why the coverage of Bahrain was so fundamentally different from the coverage of Libya. And if I may just add one more thing, because you get a lot of criticism about why did Al Jazeera cover Libya this way? Why did it cover Syria that way? I mean, if you look at what al-Qaddafi has done, if you look at what Bashar al-Assad has done, okay, fine, there are certainly flaws in the coverage of Al Jazeera, no doubt about it. They've always been flaws, but if you put those flaws next to the things that al-Qaddafi or Bashar al-Assad or any of the other autocrats have done over the years, and certainly in recent months, I mean, hell, if you want to accuse me of siding with the rebels in covering events in Libya and Syria when hundreds, thousands of people are being slaughtered, fine. I mean, that's that's a price that Al Jazeera should be willing to pay in terms of its reputation.
But I think what you said just now is earlier in your comments is key. That you have to remember that the owners of any media outlet have an agenda and are seeking to gain something.
Absolutely.
And that it's important that the audience be cognizant of where the ownership of any media outlet is coming from and have options and alternatives.
Absolutely.
And I guess one of the interesting things now, I mean, Al Jazeera has been tremendously successful and very influential in the region, but it's kind of hit a crossroads where there's now a proliferation of media in at least parts of the Middle East, and in Egypt now there's more independent television and more competitors and so on.
But it's also hit the Arab Spring itself.
Yeah, and do you think it's good actually if more competition, both kind of at the national level and the regional level, appears, so that people maybe aren't entirely dependent on whatever the Al Jazeera's owners' kind of preferences are?
Absolutely. I mean, I think competition can only be good, if not for Al Jazeera, certainly for the public. This is a public that has been dominated for the last 15 years by the narrative of Al Jazeera and the prism of Al Jazeera, which is fine. But I think that the more choices people have, the more interesting their take on what's going on in their region becomes. But it's also, competition is also good for Al Jazeera, because one direct result of lack of competition is obviously complacency. And when you become complacent, you begin to say, well, I don't have to work hard for it. I have the audience anyway. Why should I bother? The problem is that so far we have not seen that kind of competition. You have Al Arabiya, the other channel, which is funded by the government of Saudi Arabia, which has its own audience, and Al Jazeera cannot compete with it over that particular type of audience, because they do a lot more infotainment than Al Jazeera does. But Al Arabiya cannot either compete with Al Jazeera over its audience. We have seen some movement in Egypt. We had seen some movement in Egypt even before the fall of Mubarak. There were certain times when Egyptians just did not watch Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera could not compete with Egyptian television at certain times. But in times of big crisis, in times of war, whether you're talking about Gaza or Lebanon or anywhere else in the region, you get a mass exodus of viewership back to Al Jazeera.
So we're going to go to Q&A very shortly, so if people feel like lining up, I'm just going to ask you one question while people get assembled. You very recently had a quite contentious interview with Donald Rumsfeld, speaking of Al Jazeera's relationship with the last presidential administration, in which you sort of challenged him really to apologize for the civilian casualties in Iraq. And he got quite upset that you did that and kind of accused you of being too contentious and said it was something about your nature, basically, that caused you to be contentious. It was a fascinating interview, but I felt that, you know, I mean, obviously, Al Jazeera's relationship has been with Donald Rumsfeld in particular has been rather complex, shall we say. It was also very interesting, just kind of in terms of the clash of kind of journalistic cultures.
Yeah.
That I think in the United States, you know, kind of officials expect that journalists are going to come on and be relatively respectful and not kind of challenge them too much, and you know, unless it's a specific show where everybody expects it to be that way. Of course, you know, you are in a way kind of representing your audience,
Yeah.
who are very angry about civilian casualties.
Yes.
And civilian casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, having been in the region recently myself, continue to be a huge issue for people.
No, absolutely.
And certainly it seems to me, kind of from your perspective, had you not challenged him, you would have disappointed your audience tremendously.
Yes.
Anyway, so I'm just wondering if you could comment on this and in terms of the role and expectations.
Sure. I mean, he after the interview, he conveyed his displeasure about the. Well, he conveyed his displeasure to me directly after the interview and during the interview, but he also conveyed it through a friend of his who'd helped us get the interview with him. So I wrote him a letter to Rumsfeld after the interview, and I explained to him, I said, I realized that you felt that I dealt with you disrespectfully. I beg to disagree. I didn't find anything disrespectful that I said to you during the interview, but I would have been, you know, derelict in my duty as someone doing this interview for people in the Middle East, not to have pressed you hard on certain issues, namely the issue of civilians in the killing of civilians in Iraq. But look, there were two things. One is that I was doing the interview for an Arab audience, essentially, although the interview ended up airing on Al Jazeera English for a worldwide audience too. The other thing was that I was trained, as you know, I was originally the product of BBC. That's how I was trained to conduct an interview, and the interviewing culture in Europe generally, in Britain in particular, it's much more, you know, aggressive than it seems to be here in the United States, at least over the last 2 or 3 decades. Yeah. And it's funny because after the interview, when he expressed his displeasure to me, and I went back and I watched the interview, and there was one time when I kept asking him the same question 3 or 4 times, and it just took me back to a very funny interview that Jeremy Paxman had done with a government minister at that time in the UK, when I was still living in the UK. And he asked him exactly the same question 14 times. And at the end, the minister said, "I'm sorry, what was the question again?" So you know, there were many different dynamics going on in that interview. But I also have to say that what touched off that particular ethos really initially was that he at one point he told me, you're gonna have to learn how to listen. And that is one of the worst things that a politician could tell a journalist, you know, because we journalists, as you know, we don't think of ourselves as anybody's students. I mean, we've been around, we've been in this job for a certain period of time, And all we're doing is asking questions on behalf of our audience. And for a politician to tell me and my audience that we have to learn and listen usually doesn't go down well.
It's pretty patronizing sounding to me. So we'll go to questions and we'll defer to Alex.
Just a quick one. Could you talk to us about the situation with Al Jazeera English getting on cable television in the United States and what the impact of the Arab Spring has been on that?
Well, I mean, it's been an uphill struggle, and I think it was expected right from the outset that it was going to be an uphill struggle. For those who don't know, just as a reminder, now Jazeera English is on cable in New York City. That's been the latest station. It's on cable in the Washington, D.C. area, and it's on cable in Toledo, Ohio, and Vermont, and I think that's the extent of it. So, I'm sorry?
Cambridge, Mass?
Cambridge, Mass. But the kind of widespread cable availability that the channel continues to hope for, obviously it hasn't happened. When Egypt happened, and a lot of attention was focused on the coverage of Al Jazeera English in this country and how positive it was and how comprehensive it was and so on. Executives came from Doha, and I think at that time Jazeera English had received within 1 week of coverage something like 40,000 tweets of support, 10,000 emails of support within 1 week. So they literally traveled around cable companies with hard copies of that support to convince people that it's high time they reconsidered their position. And some of the cable companies, were convinced that, we're close to a breakthrough, but others didn't seem particularly swayed by the number of hard copies of support. The consolation, obviously, this is like slow release, but the consolation is that Egypt has changed, the coverage of Egypt has changed the dynamics, and that now it's only a matter of time before we get to that stage where more and more states will pick up Al Jazeera English on cable. I hope that's not too much wishful thinking.
Just one quick note before we go to the next question. For those people watching on the webcast, I know there are a number out there. If you do have questions that you want to pose through Twitter, just use the hashtag HSC25, and we'll see it on the screen there, and we can try and work those into the mix. Gentleman here.
Great. I'm Phil Balboni. I'm the CEO and founder of Global Post. Alex actually asked the very question that I was going to ask, but I'll do a little follow-up, and then I have another question. Having started a cable news network before my current company, I know how hard it is to get on cable in the United States, so please don't feel badly. It's a long, long process, and you may or may not ever actually succeed. But maybe you've drawn some conclusions from this experience about what it says about American media, and particularly television. And the second part, you referenced the hundreds of millions of dollars that the government of Qatar put into your network. I'd be interested if you could say a little bit more about the economics and how important you believe it is, the scale of investment in your network, how much that translates into the success you've been able to have out on the streets around the Arab world.
Sure. I mean, in terms of the success in the Arab world, it's self-evident that this is a channel that a lot of people feel is very close to their concerns and aspirations. And Al Jazeera obviously looks at the world for its audience through a prism that they can ostensibly relate to. But there's also the fact that right from day one, Al Jazeera has been controversial, not just in the West, it was controversial in the Arab world as well. There were a lot of people who just did not like it. either governments or people who are close to governments in the region who felt that the coverage of Al Jazeera was subversive.
Particularly during the Iraq War.
Particularly during the Iraq War. In some way, the fact that it has been controversial has worked to sort of reinforce its popularity among ordinary Arabs. And if you travel anywhere in the Arab world and you ask people, what is Qatar most associated with in your mind? Nobody says CENTCOM. Everybody says Al Jazeera. So it's a very clever equation, if you will, having CENTCOM and Al Jazeera, but nobody associates Qatar with CENTCOM. Everybody associates it with Al Jazeera. My sense is that when it was launched, it was never launched as a business enterprise. It does not make money, or if it does make money, it's not enough to actually support it. So the bulk of the money actually comes from the pocket of the emir. It comes from the government of Qatar itself. And I think that's how they meant it to be. They meant it to be more of a political enterprise than a business enterprise. They meant it as something to generate prestige and political clout for them as a country and as a government. And it has done that. I mean, if you look at the various crises that government, that Qatar now mediates in or has mediated, it's quite impressive. When the Lebanese fight among each other, they go to Doha to negotiate. When the Sudanese fight among each other, they go to Doha to negotiate. And the recent wave of revolutions in the Arab world, you mentioned Libya, for example. Again, you know, that has certainly consolidated the clout that the Qataris have garnered over the last 15 years. $1 billion, $2 billion, that's really a small change in terms of the political prestige that it has got for them. I attended a dinner where the US ambassador to Qatar spoke a few months ago, and he was talking about how measuring the power of a country has changed nowadays, and he gave the two examples of Qatar and Egypt. Huge country, 80 million people, and yet you have a small country like Qatar, not even 1 million people, which in some cases actually has a bigger political clout than Egypt does. So they're lucky that they have obviously a lot of gas, but it's not just gas. There's also a lot of vision that they have invested in, and I think their original vision of establishing a channel to get them political clout has been tremendously successful.
Thank you.
Okay, gentleman here.
Yes, I'm Richard Sobel. I was a fellow in '96, and I've taught a course at the Medill School on the press, the Pentagon, and the public. And some colleagues and I have just done a book on public opinion about the Iraq War, not just in the United States, but across Europe, and including cases from the Arab world and the Indian subcontinent, to try to see how the publics affect the decision to join the coalition, the willing or not to join. So I'm interested in both sides. This has been a fascinating discussion, but largely about how Al Jazeera is communicating or helping to communicate within the Arab world. There's been a little bit of allusion to how it's seen and how it tries to communicate to the United States or to Europe. So I'd like to ask you more about that strategy. How does that play into an approach? And I think that most of the American public and many of the political leaders, to the extent that they know, would see Al Jazeera really as presenting a perspective, distorted perspective, for instance, about the Palestinians or about Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
So how do you see the American exposition on Al Jazeera?
Sure. We're talking about the trials and tribulations of putting Al Jazeera English on cable in this country. And, you know, part of the problem, and it's not an insignificant part of the problem in my eyes, is the bin Laden tapes that had aired on the Arabic channel. And as you said, it's just given this perception to a lot of Americans, to a lot of people in the West generally, that Al Jazeera is and was the mouthpiece of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. In the Arab world, Jazeera was seen differently. A lot of people, especially in the initial stages of it, and when the decision was made to start hosting Israeli officials to directly appear on Al Jazeera, a lot of people thought that Al Jazeera was a front for the CIA. So, you know, the issue of the perception is obviously a very important one. You know, I consider myself very fortunate in the sense that I was born and raised in that part of the world, but I've also spent a good chunk of my life first in Europe and then more recently in the United States. So that puts me in a position where it puts me in a better position to try and grapple with the issue of how perceptions, the perceptions of the two worlds are different and where they interconnect or not. I don't think that, you know, running a PR campaign in the US, you know, over the issue of why we aired Osama bin Laden, I don't necessarily think that that's going to, first, it's not going to convince a lot of Americans, and secondly, I don't think it's going to necessarily help put Al Jazeera on cable. But I have to say this, one of the things that, first of all, I don't agree, I never agreed with the notion of putting a half-hour-long tape of Osama bin Laden on Al Jazeera, and I never agreed with the idea of putting a half-hour speech by President Bush on Al Jazeera. It never made sense to me. But having said that, these were two different narratives at that time, and we were talking about, you know, information control. I don't see the point of actually trying to prevent people from hearing different narratives, whether you're talking about Afghanistan or Iraq or any other issue. So to the extent that you give people in the Arab world an idea of what Osama bin Laden was actually trying to say, in a way you contribute, despite what the critics may say, to demystifying the man. He stopped being a mystery. And I think what happened in Egypt and Tunisia, revolutions led by young people who were just sick and tired of that kind of narrative that they were exposed to, I think is the ultimate confirmation that the demystifying strategy was a good strategy. I just want to say one quick thing that we talked about before the panel. When people in the Arab world and in the West talk about Al Jazeera, they talk about Al Jazeera as if it's a separate development from anything else that happened before it. And my argument is that without CNN, we may not have had Al Jazeera. And why do I say that? I say that because CNN, during the war to liberate Kuwait, shaped the war narrative at that time. CNN was the only international broadcaster allowed by Saddam to continue to broadcast from inside Iraq. And that helped shape the narrative. I remember a commercial on CNN International at that time in which Mubarak, whether he meant it or he was being facetious, but he said it. He said, I learned about the outbreak to liberate Kuwait, not through the conventional channels, but on CNN. And I think those things made a lot of Arabs think, if CNN can do it, why can't we do it? And I think that's the deep background to the creation of Al Jazeera.
We're running short on time. We did have a couple questions from the Twitter sphere, so I'm going to insert them, and we'll see what else we can do. Just quickly, I'll just give the two questions together, and maybe you can just kind of address them together. one question is just how much difference is there between the Arabic and English language content on Al Jazeera? And the second question is that Al Jazeera has been defined, at least in the West, by its coverage of crises. That's when we've come to turn to Al Jazeera. Going forward, what will Al Jazeera do in times of peace? Which I think really speaks to this question of what role does Al Jazeera play as countries like Tunisia and Egypt are actually trying to build new political systems.
Yeah, I don't think there's any danger that Al Jazeera would be out of work anytime soon, because if you look at what's happening in the region, the so-called Arab Spring, I think the so-called Arab Spring, its trials and tribulations, ups and downs, are going to be with us for some time. And when I say some time, I'm talking about the next 10 to 20 years, possibly. I don't see Al Jazeera being put out of business, although I do see the possibility of more competition for Al Jazeera, more serious competition for Al Jazeera in the region. In terms of the difference between the Arabic channel and the English channel, there are some overlaps, but there are also some fundamental differences. And those fundamental differences are obviously mostly dictated by the respective audiences. One has a global audience, one has a mostly Arabic-speaking audience. The Arabic-speaking channel knows where its audience is. It's very easy to give its coverage a specific identity. The English channel has, so many different, it covers so many different time zones and so many different cultures, so many different languages, and therefore it has been harder to give itself a specific identity, although that's beginning to happen. But I would say that the fundamental difference is obviously the kind of audience that each channel caters to.
Quick follow-up too. I mean, this has been, I think, up until our conversation, a fairly American-centric day, talking about the future of journalism from an American perspective. Is the future of, if we're kind of looking out at the world and where the future of journalism and the future, kind of where the leading edge is, that we can see, this is where we're starting to see the future, or this is where kind of the world of global journalism is heading. Where are you seeing that? Are you seeing it in the United States or in Western Europe, or are you seeing it elsewhere? And what can you say, just based on your experience, about kind of what the non-West and what media trends in the developing world, in the Middle East, in Africa, might teach us about where media is going globally?
Well, let me talk about power before I talk about that. I mean, I've been in the United States for 10 years now. I arrived in the United States about 2 years before 9/11, and then I've been here since 9/11. So I was able to see two different faces of America, if you will, before 9/11 and after 9/11. And with all this stuff, the financial meltdown and the financial crisis and all those things, I think about, just like a lot of other people, I think about the future of U.S. power. And when I look at it through the prism of what's going on now, the financial crisis and so on and so forth, there's one rationale which says that U.S. power will be increasingly defined by forces outside of the United States, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Indians, possibly the Arabs, if the Arab Spring turns out to be a success. I'm not sure if it's going to be a success yet or not. But there's another logic, if you will, and that's the logic of Admiral Mullen, who was asked a question about how he feels about the future of U.S. power, and should countries in the Middle East continue to depend on U.S. power well into the future. And he said, I realize that this country has problems, but if anybody doubts the ability of this country to recover, they will doubt it at their own risk. So if you look at it through the prism of the first logic, I see the media being, the future of the media being defined no longer by the United States and the media in the United States. The main rationale behind creating Al Jazeera English was to sort of try and reverse the flow of information. You had it coming from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, and Al Jazeera, and I hope that doesn't sound too pretentious, one of the goals of Al Jazeera English is to actually reverse that flow and have information flowing from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. But to the extent that the future of U.S. power is guaranteed over the next 50 to 100 years, I think the U.S. media have, as we all know, have had this incredible ability to define the narrative, and they will continue to do it, provided that U.S. power continues, provided that the United States continues to be the powerful country that it has been so far.
But U.S. media may perhaps have to get used to sharing the narrative-defining space with more actors, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, in a country like, in a region like the Middle East, I mean, we're already seeing signs of that. Now it's the Arab media that are defining the narrative more than, you know, the American or the European media. But having said that, we should not overlook the power of the U.S. media. I mean, we've seen this recently with the issue of the assassination, the alleged assassination plot with the Iranians. We've seen in this country, obviously, the prism has been defined by the U.S. media. And to the extent that there are alliances with the United States in the Middle East, for example, in the Gulf, the U.S. media will be able to sort of extend that prism through which to see what the Iranians are accused of having tried to do in the eyes of Arabs in that part of the world.
Well, on that provocative note, I'm afraid we are out of time, unfortunately. Thank you very much.
Thank you.